Founders Floor, a co-working accelerator for startups.
My aim for this presentation is basically to take everything I've learned about media and PR and to really give that knowledge to each of you. I think Matt had mentioned I'd written for a tech publication called VentureBeat, and I actually want to take you back to when I was first starting off. I raised some funding in Northern California for a startup, and I saw all my friends whenever they would be on like the New York Times or TechCrunch, like you knew that's when you made it, right? And I would try contacting all these media publications, and no one would ever respond to me. And I would think like, wow, I must have messed something up. Maybe I'm in trouble. What happened? And just to tell you how bad it was, this is Eric Schoenfeld. He was the editor of TechCrunch at the time. And I remember meeting him. I ran into him at an elevator, and I was so nervous around him. I told him he was a tech celebrity, and I ran out of the elevator, and he gave me this really weird look. So I was basically like rock bottom at that point. And it was basically at that point that I decided, how can I deconstruct the media process? And how can I create a process that would allow anyone, even if they didn't have prior business success, to use to get media coverage? And I'm basically going to talk to you about that coverage. And everything that I recommend here is all things that any person can use and do really effectively. I think the beauty of PR is that inherently it's a kind of a free marketing tool that people can use. Matt had mentioned, I guess my background, I was a writer for the tech publication VentureBeat, kind of had contributed to TechCrunch, to Forbes, a handful of others, a CEO of a company called Publicize. I think a big thing right now is we've used the profits to create a media incubator called Espacio. So we actually own about 40 media publications, about half of the top 10 largest startup publications in Europe we own now. And the hope is, as we continue to get bigger, we're going to keep acquiring others. Global Mentor, 500 Startups, Microsoft Accelerator, a handful of others. I think the biggest thing is that the data points I've seen have come from the perspective of writing myself, of helping a lot of startups, and also just from, we're hiring about 50 journalists this year, so you get to see what works and what's most effective. Okay, so I want to get started. The first part of this presentation, I want to explain basically this framework to contact the media. And I want to mention it's very theoretical, but so you guys understand those principles, but at the same time, I want to include very specific data points. So in this presentation, and I'm happy to send it after, you're going to see the exact emails that I sent, whether it's TechCrunch or Forbes. Even though each of your own emails are going to be different, it's going to follow those same principles. So you'll see as an example, what does it look like when a TechCrunch writer or Forbes responds to you? What's their email like? What's our follow-up email look like? And again, I think each of you can use these same, and it'll be really effective. And there's actually an acronym in the first 6-step process, and I call it FAMOUS. So to make sure it's something you guys kind of remember. And I was thinking about the best way to kind of communicate those 6 principles to each of you, that acronym. And I'm going to use an example. And the example is Espacio, which was, before it was an incubator, it was actually a co-working space, and based in Medellin, Colombia. And the reason I use this example is that when you think about a co-working space, at its heart, it's very hard to get that in the media, because in many cases, there are many co-working spaces being founded, especially internationally. And it's not, you're renting office space, it's not that kind of exciting, right? And yet, we're able to get on TechCrunch, the BBC, and a handful of others. So I want to kind of explain this, through this story, those 6 principles, the famous acronym, but please keep in mind that each of you can use these for your own companies as well, regardless of the industry. And I do want to mention ahead of time that this isn't just for tech media. I've seen this with whether it's Variety Magazine or People, the New York Times, etc. So it works across all these other industries. All right, let's get started. The first step in FAMOUS is F. It stands for formulate. And it's important when you contact the media that you formulate an announcement. So in New York, when I was writing for VentureBeat, a lot of friends would come up to me and they would say, "Hey Conrad, can you write about my company?" And I would say, "Sure, what do you have to announce?" And they would say, "Well, we don't have anything to announce." And I would say, "Well, if you don't have anything to announce, then I can't write anything because there's no story there." So a lot of people would say, "Well, what makes for a good story?" And in general, for each of your companies, you're going to have certain announcements that you're making. So let's say when you're starting off, normally your first announcement is your company is launching. That's the first announcement. Perhaps 3 months later, you raise a small round of angel funding. That could be another big announcement. Or you have a milestone, you launch an app or a new product. Each of those are announcements. So when you contact the media, it's important to say, to not say, hey, can you write about my company? What you should say is, hey, my company is making this announcement. We are releasing a new app. Would you be interested in covering this announcement? And then as an important note, one of the things you might not even realize is that within the articles, the title usually says the announcement. So as an example, the title of this TechCrunch article is Co-working Space Espacio Launches to Turn Medellin into a Startup Hub. So when you think about it, when we contacted them, we said we're launching this company called Espacio. If we'd said something like, hey, we're raising $200,000 in funding, the title would have said Co-working Space Espacio announces $200,000 in funding to turn Medellin into a startup hub. So you can actually see the announcement that's being pitched to the company within the title. All right, the second letter in the acronym is A, and it stands for amplify. So it's important when you contact the media that you make your story as big as possible. And I mentioned before, renting office space isn't particularly, that doesn't sound very interesting. And if we contacted the Financial Times or BBC, they probably would have ignored the story. But when I think about Espacio, the mission of the company wasn't to rent office space. The mission was really to turn this city in Medellin, Colombia, to the Silicon Valley of Latin America. That's what we pitched, and that's what became this interesting story. And so what I like to tell everyone is, do you know when you're in the gym or you're about to go to bed and like you're daydreaming about how big your company's going to be, right? You're like, wow, in 3 years we're going to have like 300 employees, we're going to be taking over the world, right? Like whatever vision you see in your mind there, that's what you should communicate to the media. That's really the big story that's so exciting. So something to keep in mind, some questions you could ask yourself is, how is this going to become this $100 million company? What will it look like when it has 100 employees? That's what you should really communicate to people. And there have been so many cases where, whether I'm just helping friends or other companies, where like how people read these TechCrunch or New York Times articles and they think these companies are massive, right? Because it's talking about this big mission of the company. When the reality is it's just a person or two who's living in their basement or it doesn't can't even it's still really early on, but they're able to frame that kind of big mission of the company. Just as a heads up too, the Espacio announcement, that co-working space, they'd never even they'd agreed to cover that story before we'd even opened. They didn't see any photos or anything. So just as a heads up, but they bought into that big mission of the company that we were able to communicate. So, and I mentioned that because a lot of people always ask me, hey, we want to contact the media, but we feel like before we do, we need X number of revenue or X number of employees and all these other things. And I found that not to be true, as long as you communicate well the big mission of the company. Okay, the third step is messaging. And when you contact the media, there's really 2 documents that you're gonna need. The first is an email pitch and the second is a press release. And I wanna break down each because there's a lot of confusion with this. A lot of people feel that I need a press release to sell a journalist on why they should cover my company. That's not the purpose of the press release. The purpose of the email pitch is to sell a journalist on why they should cover your story. The purpose of the press release is when somebody decides to cover the story, to make it as easy as possible for them to do so. So, and I'm going to show specific examples of each. The email pitch, there are 4 things I want you to keep in mind. The first is to lead with social proof. And I break it down into 2 types of social proof. Type 1 is the really impressive social proof. So let's say you're a Harvard MBA or Y Combinator, accelerator and founders floor, or an engineer from Google, etc. These are things that you could use to infer positive information about yourself, because I might not know, let's say, an alumni of Harvard, an MBA from Harvard, but I can infer, hey, they're probably going to be more likely to be successful. The second, what I call type 2 social proof, is something really interesting about yourself. So, for example, perhaps you're a 15-year-old developer, or you're a 65-year-old founder, or you're a former sports star. Let's say you used to be homeless, or something really interesting about your background. These are things that make a story really interesting. And I remember a little while back, this 16-year-old developer wrote me. He said, I'm a 16-year-old developer in Australia. No one from TechCrunch will ever want to cover me. I'm only 16. And I said, no, you don't understand. That's why they will want to cover you. There are not many 16-year-olds writing TechCrunch. So, and every person has those 1 or 2 things that are either interesting or really impressive about yourself that you can lead with. The other thing is to include links to social profiles. So at the very least, LinkedIn and Twitter. And the reality is most of the people that you contact, you won't have a prior relationship with, but you're basically, and there are actually a lot of fake stories that are being sent out. So when you include a link to your LinkedIn as an example, you're basically saying, hey, I'm putting my name behind this story. We may not know each other, but we probably have some mutual connections, etc. And just to reiterate, I think about, let's say, being in Entrepreneur Magazine and these other publications, people always ask me, oh, Conrad, you must have been close friends with those people. And the reality is I have a very, a large network within the media, but most of the people that I was contacting who decided to cover, I didn't have a prior relationship with. But if you use things like social proof with LinkedIn, people will still be really responsive to you. The third thing is to address a journalist by name in the subject line. You're going to greatly improve open rates. And the last thing is to communicate via email. I remember at VentureBeat, about half our stories were sent to tips@venturebeat.com. Those emails are read. We've actually used things like tracking systems for open rates, and almost all the emails sent to tips, whether it's at TechCrunch or these others, are opened up. In general, what you have is you have an editor who gets those emails and they forward those emails on, if it's of interest, to specific journalists who on their team who are going to be more likely to cover them. I'm going to show you just as an example. It's probably going to be better that I send this PowerPoint after to each of you, but this is an example of an email that actually a team member had sent to Forbes that had been covered. Let me go through the press release response first. But so you can see kind of the specific principles. The second part is a press release and why those are, what's the purpose of a press release? A couple things to keep in mind is that they follow very specific formats. The second thing is to use data whenever possible. So a lot of people, when they used to pitch, when people pitch me for stories, they'll say something like, hey, I'm the founder of this device. This is such a big market that we're entering. That's why it's so interesting. And I always say to people, what does big even mean? Is that 5 million? Is that 500 billion? So whenever you can use data points, that's really important as well. And I have a number of examples. I also have in this presentation. Okay, so I'm just gonna read off this timeline of how this happened. So if you want to see the exact kind of progression for this, we sent one email. This wasn't myself, this is a team member. We sent one follow-up email, and I'll go through each email. We had one email response asking for a phone call. This was the list of questions that were asked to me on the phone, and this was the end result on Forbes magazine. So I just want to kind of go through this process, because a lot of people, I always mention, sometimes for, let's say, someone wants to contact the New York Times, I'll actually send them the email, write it out for them, and send them the exact email that you send. They just have to send the send button. But people kind of have this mental block of like, no, I can't do it. It's this kind of black box that I don't know what's going to happen. So just to kind of explain kind of the principles of this. This was actually a team member as well who had contacted him. He said, he addressed the person by name. Hi, Freddie, I hope all is well. I'm writing to see if you may be interested in an exclusive. It's for the company I work for. Having an exclusive in Forbes would mean the world. It introduces the company. The company is Publicize. Its mission is to change the way startups approach PR. I wanted to mention, normally what I recommend people do is basically highlight 3 things in the email that are particularly almost different potential angles that people may find interesting. And the idea being, ideally, one of those angles people would particularly find interesting and focus on. So as an example for us, it says Publicize, a company based in Medellin, Colombia. That was one of the points that we found a lot of journalists would stand out, and if people were interested in Latin America, they could focus on that angle. The second thing that I would include is that the entire team has backgrounds in journalism. And the third was just about the mission of the company. But for each of you, let's say one of your companies, one of your founders, let's say both graduated from Stanford. That could be one of the interesting points. Let's say the second interesting point could be about the size of the market, and the third could be a way that your product differentiates itself from others in the market. But by kind of dividing it to 3, I found that to be really effective. So what I always tell people is, You always send at least one follow-up. Expect no one to send a response in the first email. And just as a data point, I remember contacting somebody, this might have been on behalf of Microsoft, and we sent out, let's say, 20 emails, and we got 0 responses in the first email. And we sent one follow-up, and it was something like 10 or 11 of people then responded to the follow-up. And this is actually just a generic follow-up that anyone can use. And just as an example, hope all is well. I know you're busy, but I want to send a quick follow-up. One line I always like to add is saying something like, I know you're really busy. If you don't have the chance to respond, thanks so much for your time. It could literally just be a line or two. In general, I recommend only one follow-up. The idea being, usually that'll kind of get the point across, and any bit more, and it could kind of bother somebody. But always recommend. So he gets this response, says, hi Jim, I don't check this email as much as I used to. Could you please direct, would Conrad be available? Usually they respond and said, you'll be available for a call, basically. In general, the phone interviews I've gone on that you should kind of keep in mind, you would be asked the following questions. The first is, usually it's just a friendly kind of, almost like an icebreaker. Just tell me a little about your company, basically. And you should have a few kind of, probably about 30 to 60 second kind of pitch ready to discuss about your company. Why it's unique and special, and kind of the big mission of the company. The second question they're usually going to ask is about your company. So they'll say something like, hey, can you talk about some of the other companies and competitors in this space? And you should be prepared to talk about that. It'd be very unusual if, it'll seem suspicious if the answer is we don't have any competitors in this space. So kind of expect to talk at least a line or two about what those other companies are and how you differentiate from them. I also don't recommend kind of putting down those other companies, but there are ways that you could highlight your strong suits by not necessarily speaking poorly about other companies in the space. The third question is talk to me about what is this specific announcement? What are you launching? If it's a new product, can you talk to me about some of the specific features of it? I think a question you should ask is that goes along with, hey, why? Not only was why this announcement important, but one of the things you'll find if you list 3 angles is that in general, most journalists will be particularly interested about one angle, and they'll start asking you more questions about that. So for example, with Publicize, we would start to get a lot of questions about Medellin, and so I would just have to kind of be prepared to answer about those questions. But you'll find if you list 3 angles, they'll tend to want to focus on one of them in particular. And the last thing is, what are some of the upcoming challenges you have? And I think the big thing is just it's almost like if you're raising funding actually for a venture capital firm, and they say, tell me about some of these upcoming challenges. You say, oh, we don't have anything. We're gonna kill it. It's probably almost better to list a challenge or two, because it looks somewhat suspicious if you don't have anything at all. And this is the result of the article. Just going back to the O in famous, with Espacio, the co-working space, I remember when we got on TechCrunch, we emailed the Next Web about 2 days later, and this nice reporter named Anaheim responded, and she said, Conrad, this is a really interesting story, but I just saw TechCrunch covered it 2 days ago. We're no longer interested, but please let me know when you have your next announcement. And when you think about it, this is actually a common recurrence that a lot of entrepreneurs have, which is that news publications, they build their reputation on breaking news stories. And once one publication covers it, others will be less likely to cover the same story, right? So how do you deal with this issue? And there are basically two solutions. You can either offer an exclusive or you can offer an embargo. And I want to explain the difference, because you'll actually notice in the email, in the subject line and also in the email to Forbes, we offered an exclusive. What that means is they have first right to publish the specific announcement. So that announcement we were doing was about a version 2.0 launch. So just to explain, so the difference with the embargo though is you're basically going to contact, let's say, 20 news outlets and say, hey, we're going to make this announcement about a launch of our new product. And we're going to make it not this Wednesday at 1 p.m. East Coast time, and ideally we ask that we're going to send you the press release and all the information, but we ask that you not publish it until that time. So ideally that time and date comes up, and a lot of publications cover it. It's a big win for your company. And I want to mention, every day you experience embargoes, you just don't realize it. So a lot of times you'll see a big company or the government will make an announcement, let's say 1 o'clock, and 1 minute later, let's say 5 or 6 news publications have all covered it. And when we think about it, it's impossible for them to cover it within that shorter period of time. But the reason they can do that is they were given the information ahead of time, and they agreed to the embargo to not publish it until that specific time. Now, a lot of people ask, hey, well, is it better to do an exclusive or embargo? And it's really risk reward. With the exclusive, the benefit you have is you could basically look to try to guarantee a certain amount of coverage, because you can contact TechCrunch on Monday, and if you don't hear back from them with the exclusive, you can contact VentureBeat, you can contact Wired Magazine, and if you don't hear back from anyone within 2 weeks, you can kind of go back and say, let me kind of refine the pitch, because maybe I'm doing something wrong, and then let me go out again for exclusive. So, and ideally, at least one of these huge publications will cover you, and it's going to be a win no matter what. And then you could further coverage with other media. The other option is with the embargo. It's you might contact all these and no one decides to cover it, and maybe you send out a newswire, and by that time the news is already out and it's already old news, and you can't. It's high risk, high reward essentially. I think in general what I recommend to people is if it's larger than, let's say, a seed round of funding, to go with the embargo. But if it's smaller, let's say it's a new product launch, to go with an exclusive. And the idea behind that is that let's say someone raises $5 million, that's a big announcement because that doesn't happen very often. So it becomes much more special. As opposed to if you reach 100,000 users, like that happens pretty frequently. So it'll be harder to get the largest publications to agree to an embargo with that announcement. The fifth step I call it unrelenting, and the idea with this is to try to further coverage as much as possible. So let's say you do get an exclusive and a TechCrunch covers your company, and let's say you have a sports app. The reality is that there's so many publications, not just within technology, but let's say sports as well, these other industries, that would be interested in covering it as well. And if you have the mindset of no one will cover my company, my announcement, unless I contact them, then it'll force you to be as proactive as possible. Again, I see it so often. A founder will come to me and they'll say, no, you know what, Business Insider has never covered my company. They must not like us. You can just ask, hey, have you ever contacted a writer there? And often the answer is no, but there's for some reason, there's this expectation that they should be covered. So just keep in mind to be as proactive as possible. And it could even be things like, hey, maybe you attended a university and they have an alumni magazine, and you have this big announcement, you should contact them, etc. And I'm going to talk about it later, but one of the big benefits, actually, I think PR is a secret weapon for SEO, which you have these kind of important publications and websites linking to you, and there are all these long-term benefits that you get from that. So if you're this is kind of a neat window of opportunity for you to be as proactive as possible to generate as much media, and it's just something to be taken advantage of. I believe that's so important because let's say you do make an announcement, there's that window. So it might be a handful of weeks where it's still really interesting, and after that, the news cycle moves on. If you launch in January, you really can't in April still be kind of talking to people about your launch, if that makes sense. The other thing I want to talk about is it's important when you do further coverage that you contact the most time-sensitive publications first. So as an example, let's say you get on TechCrunch on Monday. You probably have about 24 hours to contact all other tech publications, or that window of news has gone by. It's just old news. Usually the middle ground of publications would be publications that were historically monthly magazines, so like an Entrepreneur magazine or a Forbes or a Wired. You can contact them a few days later, and they will still cover that announcement if it's interesting enough, even if it's past a handful of days. Usually the least time sensitive would be local news publications, as an example, or even more industry verticals, where like you could contact them even a week later after the announcement, and they would still cover it. As opposed to, again, if TechCrunch covers it on Monday, if you don't contact VentureBeat later that day, it's they've moved on already. I also recommend at this point to coordinate with social platforms such as Product Hunt. Product Hunt is similar to similar to Reddit. People can ideally get posted on the homepage and the number of upvotes, and if somebody is in the first or second place, the amount of traffic you can drive would probably be similar to about a TechCrunch feature. And the one thing I want to mention for Product Hunt, if anyone wants to write me after, I'm happy to send the moderator emails. In general, if anyone were to visit Product Hunt and submit their startup to be profiled on the homepage, they don't have the ability to do that. About 90% of people aren't able to upload, and the few that can, it actually goes into this kind of random URL offline, and if it gets enough upvotes, then it hits the homepage, which is where everyone wants to be. So what I always recommend to people is there are I believe about 15 to 20 moderators for Product Hunt throughout the world, and write them, and again, I'm happy to send the email of some, write them asking for them to submit your product on Product Hunt. And when they do it, it immediately hits the homepage. And the reason why that's important is the homepage is kind of like the homepage of the New York Times. That's where everyone visits and sees and gets the most upvotes. But by doing that, you're able to kind of bypass this large system. You can also as well consider using a newswire at this time. There are a lot of confusions about newswire. Many people know of like a business wire or like a PR web. If you go back about, let's say, 15, 20 years, a lot of journalists, they'd visit these newswires to get new announcements. Today, it's really not used for that purpose. People use it more for, let's say, SEO, to just kind of index their specific announcement. It's not that but I've never known of anyone saying like, hey, I was reading this really interesting announcement on Business Wire, so I decided to pick up on the story. So if you do use a newswire, I'd recommend like one of those a much more affordable option with the purpose being to kind of index your announcement online, as opposed to the purpose being, hey, I want to do this I want to pay $1,000 to a Business Wire, and then I'm going to get on the Wall Street Journal and all these publications. Because this is one data point, but I've never seen that happen. We also have this is a list of media to contact, but if people write me as well, I'm happy to give a more in-depth one in that. Okay, the 6th step, strategize, the S in famous. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that you can really look forward the next 6 months and identify these upcoming announcements and almost use it as a forcing function for your own team to get them motivated around these specific milestones that you have. So I found that the most effective companies look to follow this famous process every 8 to 12 weeks. And as a comparison, there are a lot of Y Combinator startups that I know who, let's say in 2013, they'll raise $2 million in funding and they get on all this media coverage. And then 2 years later, they raise another $2 million and they get all this media coverage again. And on one hand, that's great. But when you think about it, there are all these opportunities between them that they didn't contact the media. Maybe they launched, version 2.0, or maybe they launched a new app, etc. And they missed out that there was that opportunity cost that they missed. And just as an example, when I showed you the prior Forbes article, a lot of people came to me and they said, "Hey, how is version 2.0 different than version 1.0?" I remember I was like, "Man, they're really not that. They really weren't that different." And there's so many times as well. It's almost more how you frame things. So maybe for your own products and companies, you have been announcing all these new features as well, and in each individual feature, a journalist probably won't cover that. It's not newsworthy enough. But if you frame it differently and say, hey, we're not just launching these new features. Actually, over the course of the past 6 months, we're now launching version 3.0, and that becomes a lot more interesting. It's much more easier to get coverage. One thing as well is being as creative as possible with the names, because I remember we later we were launched something called Publicize 3.0. Okay, this was after this, and when we had the press release all filled out, and I contacted TechCrunch and all these other publications, and no one was interested in Publicize 3.0. And I went home and I thought about it. It was a free version of Publicize basically. And I went home and I thought about it, and I was like, you know what, Publicize version 3.0, it just doesn't sound right. I don't really love it. So I remember I went home and I said, I slept on it. I said, you know what? The name's not right. As opposed to Publicize version 3.0, it's called Publicize 0 because it's free for people to use. And that's literally all I changed. Same press release, same email, everything. Just changed it to Publicize 0. And then all these people were responding to it, even though it was exactly the same thing. So just something to keep in mind is that the name and kind of how you frame it is so important as well. You know what? I mentioned little things to help you stand out, but just Matt had brought up a really good question, which is, hey, when should I contact the media? When's the right time? And everything I mentioned here, I would say it's a general rule that probably applies 95 to 98% of the time. So of course there are going to be exceptions, but in general, I said contact the media 10 to 14 days before you launch a new product. Let's say you launch a new version, so version 2.0 or 3.0. I would look to combine all these, as opposed to individually adding new features and announcing them, because again, that's not particularly newsworthy. Combine it into an upgraded version. If you raise an angel round of funding, a VC round of funding, so you launch a Kickstarter campaign, you announce a large partnership or a key UT member, you reach a milestone, for example, 100,000 users. Let's say you're hosting a large event. That could be another occasion. Let's say you release a mobile app for Android, etc., or for another operating system, or competitors in the news. And I'm gonna give a specific example. I'll go back to that in a second. I also wanted to list just little things that you could apply very quickly that will greatly kind of enhance your brand. I think the first thing is, to me, one of the best investments a founder can make is in a website design. And the reason why is it really shouldn't cost that much money. I mean, especially if people go online. And but you talk to some exceptional founders who are spending months developing their technology ideas. But the reality is as a journalist, there's so much thin slicing that goes on, right? Like I decide whether I'm going to cover a story probably within 30 seconds of visiting a website or hearing about the founder. So someone doesn't have like an hour to kind of pitch their idea in their time, if that makes sense. So the website is really, when you pitch a journalist, that's the first thing they're visiting. So at the very least, you should make sure that the design looks nice. And again, there are a lot of really affordable options to do that. The second is to highlight 1 to 2 points of social proof. And one of the things to keep in mind is a lot of these principles apply in that it's less about contacting the media and more about contacting people who are very busy and are just bombarded with emails. Because if many of these people, if they're getting 300 emails a day, like how do you make yours stand out? And I'll give a perfect example. When I was in Medellin a few weeks ago, I got 2 emails. The first was a person who said, "Hey, I'm a backpacker who's I'm a bootstrap entrepreneur, and I'd love to buy you a coffee and pick your brain," or something like that, pick your mind. And the second person said, "Hey, I'm visiting for a few days. I'm currently in Y Combinator, and I'm the co-founder of this pretty popular startup." And I hadn't met any of them, but like but it would be much more likely that that I have limited time, that I would choose the person who has social proof. So something again to keep in mind, these principles is less about contacting the media and more to say, what are those 1 to 2 points that you can use to kind of highlight and make yourself stand out. I mentioned, remember to always send 1 follow-up. The line I always include in all emails, and I recommend others as well, is, "I know you're really busy if you don't have the chance to respond." I find that to be really effective, just showing, hey, I understand you're bombarded with emails, and I want to be as kind of respectful as possible. And the last option as well is to offer an exclusive. Just again, keeping in mind that it's a way that you could easily get your pitch to stand out. And that's something that I recommend including in the subject line and the first line. Like as an example of a subject line, let's say it was to Anthony Ha at TechCrunch. The subject line could be like exclusive for Anthony, and just a short description about what your company's doing. Okay, some big mistakes. The first one is not contacting the media at all, and I use that there because this is what happens like 95% of the time, which is that someone decides not to contact the media. They feel like if they do, that there's going to be all this negative coverage. And just something to keep in mind, especially if you're a part of a startup, where you are as part of the news cycle. So have you ever noticed if there's a homeless person in New York and they fall on the street, like no one really cares, right? But if you have Kim Kardashian, who does the same thing happen, she falls on the street, like it'll be like on the homepage of like People magazine, right? Like photos of her, etc., like an exclusive, like interviews with people who are around the area. Maybe not that extreme, but the reason why, when you think about it, is that essentially people look to build people up in the news media, and once they reach a certain level, then you have to be a lot more careful because people essentially try to tear them down. And this happens with individuals, this happens with companies as well. But it's important when you're starting a company that you recognize when you haven't even been built up, it doesn't make sense to have a negative article on you. They're going to ignore you as opposed to spend time writing an article about you. And again, thinking about myself, I've seen tens of thousands of data points. Just thinking about Publicize, right? We have only ever, out of all those instances, okay, only ever had one negative article on a company. And as a note, the journalist it was basically a location app that said it was anonymous, but they were actually tracking the individual. And the journalist actually responded nicely and said, hey, they basically gave us a heads up about this, and the founder was still actually really happy, and it ended up all working out well. But if you just think about tens of thousands of data points, out of all those instances, I've only ever seen one that this article was negative. That for each of you, the benefit of that is if they're going to cover you, then it's the probability is very, very high that it's going to be a nice article about your company. Something to keep in mind. A big no-no is not to offer an exclusive to multiple publications on each day. So as an example, on Monday, if you offer an exclusive to TechCrunch and VentureBeat, and they both respond and say yes, you have to choose one to get the exclusive, right? And it's very easy to be put on a blacklist if you decide to if you decide one as opposed to the other. So just something to keep in mind there. A solution to that is just to let in the email, hey, this exclusive is only valid for 24 hours. That's one solution. I did want to mention it's okay to offer an exclusive to people from the same media publication. So as an example, let's say you contact two writers at TechCrunch offering an exclusive and they both say yes. I found people are fine giving up an exclusive as long as it's to somebody within the same media organization, but that's not true when it's a different one. The third is just not being responsive to emails from the media and not being respectful of reporters' time. And I think the last one would be not contacting enough media, because in the back of your mind, if you're expecting, hey, maybe ideally 10 to 15% of the media that I contact we're going to cover, and then you only contact, let's say, 6 or 7 media publications, like it doesn't really add up, because you might come back and think like, hey, this just wasn't successful for me, but it had less to do with your pitch and everything, and more that you didn't contact enough media, essentially. Going back about many people often ask about competitors in the news and the approach. This is an exact email template that I recommend people use. So in this case, there's a company called Skin Vision. They basically help, it's an app for healthcare. One of their competitors was in the news, and this is an example of contacting the journalists who cover their competitor. So in this case, this was the BBC who contacted them. So I'll just read it off shortly. It said, hi, the journalist named James. Hope all's well. I'm writing this, you earlier covered this article, and this is a link to the articles. I want to write to introduce you to another company in the space, a line or two about the company. I thought this may be of interest to you, and basically listing out kind of what I mentioned before. Let's say about 3 or 4 points about this is why this company is interesting, etc. So, and each of you, again, will have those points for why you're different, your product's different from your competitors' companies. I ended by saying, if you may be interested in speaking with the founders, I would love to connect you to their CEO. Best wishes and thanks for your time. Now again, that template, you of course won't use this exact same email, but you can imagine, you could literally copy paste that email for your own and switch out information for your own and use it. And just as a heads up, so when the BBC Wired, maybe it was VentureBeat, a handful of other publications covered, almost all of them responded to this email. And they either said, hey, thanks so much for your email. I'll be sure to, almost all the emails looked like, I'll be sure to keep this company out for future articles about this space. So journalists would almost never retroactively go back and change their article to include it, but it's good if you want to kind of keep them front and center. It's a good idea to have kind of a similar strategy to that. Okay, this to me is one of the most important slides in this presentation. So after I left VentureBeat, I would always just help out my friends with PR and media. And I remember before I started Publicize, I thought, hey, is this working? When I'm helping my friends with media, is it working because I'm helping, or because it's about the process? because if it was only about the relationships, I thought I don't really want to get involved in this space because too many things are changed. People leave publications. I didn't think there would be solid enough footing. And the very first company that contacted me was this one, Safely Filed. And it was this founder who was based in the middle of the country. He's over 60 years old. He has no network in the media whatsoever. And I told him, I said, hey, I'm going to help you, but on one condition. Nobody can know that I'm involved. So when I emailed them, he created an email, marksnow@safetyfiled.com, just for me, that I would email. So when I'm contacting people at TechCrunch or New York Times, I'm saying, hi, my name's Mark. No one knows that Conrad Egusa is involved, right? And I said, I followed the exact process, the famous process, those steps that I just explained. And I remember I was super nervous because I sent out all these emails, and I woke up the next morning thinking like, hey, is this actually going to work? Are people going to respond? Because I'm not involved. No one knows that I'm helping here. And I remember I woke up and I checked my emails, and I didn't get any responses back. So I was super disappointed. I'm like, oh man, I've let Mark Snow down. Maybe all this media stuff, maybe it is about the relationship and not about the process. So I said, let me just give it 24 more hours to see if this works. So I go to bed. The next day happens. I go and check my email, and super nervous. And when I open up the email, I still don't have any responses back. So I'm like, oh, this is just terrible. I guess everything I just explained to you, the famous process, doesn't work because it's all about the relationship. And then I get this call from Mark Snow, and he says, Conrad, you've been doing an amazing job. We've gotten so many responses back. And I thought, how is this possible? And I remembered I've been emailing as mark.s.snow@safetyfiled.com, but I've been checking my personal emails for the responses. So I go and open up his email, and we've gotten all these responses. There was VentureBeat, there was The Next Web, there was Pando Daily, a number of other publications. And then all my friends would come to me and say, oh, Conrad, of course you got on VentureBeat, you used to write there. And I'd say, no, you don't understand. No one knew that I was involved helping here. I was writing as Mark. And just other data points that we collected is we tested this. We basically put people into 4 tiers of their chances of being on the largest media. And we found if we emailed on behalf of the client, on behalf of me, or on behalf of a random team member, that the results were almost the same across the board. So to me, the implication of this is so many people come up to me and they're like, no, I can only get on the New York Times if like my best friend is a writer there. They always say that. And I always tell them, no, I've seen tens of thousands of data points. And that if you follow the right process and you're effective, any person can get media coverage, even if they don't have this kind of prior success to stand on. And I want to hammer that over and over again because I think that's the most common misconception that's impacting people. Okay. Second section outside of the famous acronym is on thought leadership, and I think this is kind of a huge win that doesn't cost any money, that people can use very, very effectively. So I mentioned before the famous acronym. To me, it's most effective every 8 to 12 weeks. And the idea with that is that you don't want to contact people to wait 6 months or a year to contact the media. But at the same time, sometimes people come to me and they're like, hey, we're going to contact the media every single week because we're going to announce 10,000 users and then 10,500 users, then 11,000 users, whatever it is. So the 8 to 10 to 12 weeks is kind of a barometer of, hey, contact frequently but not too frequently. But when you think about it, there's actually some down period there as well. And one of the things with Espacio was I realized, well, we're not going to be making any announcements. What we can do is we could write articles for TechCrunch, for these large publications, related to the space. And even though it's not going to be super self-promotional, it'll still promote what we're doing. So this is the exact email I sent to TechCrunch prior to really getting to know them, asking if I could contribute the prior article about Columbia's ecosystem. And they accepted and they published the article, and over time it was basically my foot into the door where it became more regular contributions. But the reason why I mention it to everyone is, let's say somebody has an accounting software startup. The reality is you can't write an article for Inc. magazine about why your startup's great, right? It's too self-promotional. But what you can do is you can say, hey, here are 3 trends we see impacting the accounting industry, or here are three ways that technology and innovation is impacting this space. And you'll be positioned as a thought leader, and it'll have a link in your byline and all these, and the benefits of SEO and traffic, etc. I find will be really effective. And that's a strategy that every single person here, whether you have a startup or whether you have a consultancy or a service company, can use really effectively. And I mean, you can do it today as well. So that's the exact email. Again, everyone will have their own. I want to mention some of the mistakes I see people make. Usually the first one is that it's way too self-promotional, the article. So in the back of your mind, the topic should be about your specific space, but it shouldn't be, you should almost aim not to even mention your company in there, especially to begin with. And the idea being as well, just sounds too like an advertorial. The other thing is it has to be an exclusive for that specific publication. So the article can't have been published elsewhere. So if you, for example, publish it on medium.com and then email, let's say VentureBeat to publish it, no one would ever accept that. They want to first be there. What I always recommend to people is first look to get these articles on Wired Magazine and some big publications, and then repost them once they've been published on your LinkedIn, on Medium, kind of these other channels as well. A lot of people, they usually ask like, hey, this is just going to take too much time, so I just want to kind of go over some strategies there. The first is, many people do have a company blog, and that's usually the best place to start because you've already spent time creating this content. You could basically reformat it. And some things to keep in mind is almost all these guest articles follow a 5-paragraph format. So you can actually remember back in high school, you kind of have your introduction, and usually the last sentence in the introduction has kind of the thesis of the article. Then you have your 3 main points, usually the first and the third are the strongest points, followed by the conclusion of kind of just reiterating what it is. In general, most publications are going to aim for about 1,000 words. Some publications will be okay for 1,500 plus, but 1,000 words is probably a good kind of length that you should aim for. The reason I mention this is the other mistake I see people making contacting the media is they send an email and say, hi, my name is John. Can I write a guest article for your publication? And the editor, if you think about it from their perspective, they're like, I don't know, John. I don't know. What if I say yes, then he sends an article and it's bad? But then I don't really want to say no at that point, right? So I'm just not going to respond. So that's what ends up happening, right? But what you should do is the first time that you email, you should attach your guest article to there, and you should say, hey, this isn't published. This hasn't been published anywhere. It's not self-promotional. I think it would be a great fit for your publication. And often what they'll say is like, hey, this is actually a really good article. We'll publish it in 14 days. And hey, and if you ever want to send future articles, please feel free to. And that's basically your foot in the door to build this future relationship. So at a certain point, in many cases, they'll actually give you direct WordPress contributor access. So you'll get a login, you can submit articles directly to that. But your first step should be doing the article ahead of time and sending it to them, if that makes sense. And again, a lot of people, they'll say, that TechCrunch editor, you can use that same template. I didn't have a relationship with the editor before pitching the first article. So again, the same things I'm mentioning that I've done myself, you can each do as well. The guest articles should not be self-promotional. Again, especially the first article that you submit to somebody, I wouldn't even mention your company. You're going to be included in the byline anyway with a link to your company. So it's not that you won't be mentioned, but it's just within the context of the article. A lot of people always ask is like, what makes for good guest articles? And what I like to tell people is you should ask yourself this question, which is, what are 3 things that I know about this subject that I've learned that I didn't know before I got started? So just as an example, I mentioned Medellin, Colombia. If I were to ask somebody who's, let's say, spent a month in Colombia, hey, tell me 3 things about Colombia. They would usually say something like its weather, its population. I could just Google Colombia and find out that information. That's not really exciting, right? But the best question to say is, hey, tell me 3 things about Colombia for a guest article that you learned that you didn't know prior to visiting there for the first time. And then usually what they'll say is like, it's kind of funny watching this. They'll kind of like go back in their head and they'll pause for a second because they have to actually think it through. They have to kind of go deep and say, what are those 3 things I've learned that I didn't know about? And then that information right there, that's what becomes really interesting. And for each of you, and I'm going to mention the thought leadership, is one of the best things you could do is take this knowledge that you've learned through your own startup that and talk about it and almost repurpose it. So let's say somebody here has a startup in the hardware space, and they've had to go abroad to build a prototype for their startup. The question I'd ask them is like, hey, what are 3 things you've learned about building a prototype abroad that you didn't know about prior to starting? And usually what they'll say is that they'll kind of zone out for like 10 seconds, and then they say, okay, well, you're right, like here's what I've learned. I've learned that like when I first started, I thought that I would have to spend $100 for this, but it turns out that there are all these extra taxes in this specific country that actually ends up being that the cost on average is 250% that. And so that's point 1. And then, okay, tell me what point number 2 is. And point number 2 they say is like I've learned that there's actually this new legislation that allows you to reduce your taxes by 50%. There's all this information they've learned having gone through the process that they didn't know about before. So then what you can look at it and say, hey, well that's a great article for Entrepreneur Magazine, and it's 3 tips on building your prototype abroad as an example. And it'll include again the person's profile, his link to the website, etc. And each of you, again, you can take those same principles for your own companies and your own space to basically become a thought leader and kind of an own share of mind in that specific area. On a kind of a very similar note, one of the things to keep in mind is that even the definition of media has really changed in a lot of ways. And when you contact a journalist, I like to think about is your goal is to basically contact gatekeepers who have access to these large networks. So an example is a journalist, they have access to these large readerships, but there are actually many different gatekeepers. A gatekeeper could be, let's say, an administrator to a really popular YouTube channel or a really popular podcast, or could be a moderator to Product Hunt, etc. One very popular avenue would be podcasts, and I actually have a very specific. One of the things I found, I think I contacted maybe 30 popular podcasts, and almost all of them responded. And it was a really neat opportunity just to kind of promote your company, etc. through this. And this is actually the exact email that I sent out to them. I said, "Hi, hope all is well. My name is Conrad Egusa." The pitch was very similar. A brief description about myself. So here's an example. I said, "Hi, I hope all is well. My name is Conrad Egusa, LinkedIn." And I linked to my LinkedIn profile. The reason I do that is, for what I mentioned before about including links to your social profiles, right? I didn't know who these people were. The second line is, I'm a former writer at VentureBeat and a global mentor of 500 startups. Again, I don't know these people, but just by listing those 2 things, they can infer, hey, if he used to write at VentureBeat, if he's a mentor at 500 startups, he probably knows what he's talking about, right? I wanted to write because I've loved the work that you've done in your podcast. If you may be interested in looking at potential interviews on this space, I'd love to be considered. Again, all of you guys can imagine copying and pasting this email into your own and just switch out the link to your LinkedIn, etc. And then I include some links to social profiles at the very bottom. Again, I mentioned podcasts because it's just another avenue that is very popular and can provide some great exposure for each of your own companies. What I like to say is I look at these announcements, so going back to the famous acronym in thought leadership, it's basically being these pillars. And to me, the most effective companies, if you look to make announcements every 8 to 12 weeks and in downtime, look to pursue this thought leadership, that ends up creating this kind of spiral that becomes, that kind of compounds. And Dave McClure, actually this past year, he was in the news for very negative reasons, but this was actually created earlier. And for a long time, whenever this is an article that Inc. magazine wrote about Dave McClure, and Dave McClure didn't contact Inc. for that article, but whenever these large publications like Inc. or Forbes were writing about accelerators, they would include Dave in those articles. And the reason why they included him is because he owns share of mind for that specific space. When people thought of early stage investments or accelerators, they would think of him. And the reason why I mention is when you think about your long-term goal for PR, it should be to own share of mind in a really specific space. So you want, when the New York Times is writing an article on a specific area, for them to say, hey, your name, it kept coming up, so I'd love to do an interview. As opposed to you having to be as kind of proactive for a lot of these different things. I would say the benefit that PR has over time is that it does get easier over time. It's very hard starting off, but it gets easier as your own profile grows. And I want to mention with PR and the media, I look at short-term benefits and long-term benefits. So PR is one of many marketing channels. You could do advertising, you could do SEO, you could do email marketing, social media, etc. Right? And I think in the short term, PR actually underperforms other marketing channels. So just as an example, let's say your goal is to get on TechCrunch, and that article sends you 1,000 clicks to your website, right? Like the reality is you could go to Facebook's advertising platform and you'll get a lot more than 1,000 clicks, right? For a relatively small amount of money. So in the short run, there are other ways that are more effective. But I think in the long run, PR actually outperforms these other marketing channels. I think there are a few reasons why. I think the first is PR does compound over time, so it does get easier. They're kind of a longer term benefit. I think the second is that PR, I do look at it as a secret weapon for SEO. I think search does still drive, depending on your specific industry, but it could easily drive over 50% of your traffic via Google and other search engines, and it will improve your rankings being ranked on these leading publications. So those are two other things to keep in mind. I also want to mention a slide about basically the media industry is changing a lot. So what are some things that you should keep in mind and also kind of optimize for? The first is that I do expect media financial struggles to continue, and you're going to see more enterprises and individuals actually acquiring a lot of these news publications. So it's something you should kind of keep your eye out for. The second is you're going to see continued fragmentation across platforms. So again, if you go back, let's say 20 years, PR was about contacting journalists. Then maybe 20 years it was about contacting journalists and bloggers. And I do believe in the future it's going to be about contacting journalists, bloggers, and gatekeepers. So again, you'll notice when you're making these pitches, like it's not just about contacting these popular publications. You could reformat and reuse a lot of the same pitches, whether it's to podcasts, etc. That'll be really effective. I think you're going to see increased editorial via thought leadership. So when a lot of these publications are laying off journalists, they're going to be looking for individuals to contribute articles to, and I do think it's something you're going to get a positive return on investment on. And I say this just because I think about my own companies. When it was almost like clockwork. We knew whenever we did an article for Inc. magazine, let's say, we knew we'd get a certain amount of social engagement and a certain number of new leads that would come in. So the ROI was always there, even in the short term. So that's why I feel so confident recommending that strategy to other people. I think PR as well is going to expand. It's really about company communication as a whole. I've raised funding for about 5 startups so far, and one of the things I noticed was the way I would pitch TechCrunch was actually really similar to the same way I would pitch a venture capitalist, right? Like you include social proof, you make the vision as large as possible, right? So when you're thinking about everything that goes into this, whether it's an email pitch or a press release, just something to keep in mind is that it's really about how you communicate your company to the world as opposed to the specific kind of segment of journalists. I think the last thing is for people who are interested in going from kind of internet famous to mainstream, so I'm going to focus on is images and video. These tend to be much more powerful mediums as well, as opposed to pure text. So just something to think about. I believe that's everything for myself. If there are any questions, I'm here after to talk to everyone. I have a bunch of free resources as well, and I'm really happy to help. And it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.